Here was the role of the ILO and the World Bank in creating a space for more deliberative, equitable contestation. Right? Initially, potentially setting in motion very non-best practice approaches, with the sense that there were non-binding rules and outcomes that came from this meeting. The only way you could get an initial first movement agreement for all these parties to even sit around a table was that whatever outcome occurred was non-binding. Right? Now, why would you think that was even remotely worth showing up if the point of the meeting was going to have nothing actionable? 450 cases later, we have the beginnings of a Cambodian labor law that is imbued with a local legitimacy, that has a content and a form that is a product of a space unique to Cambodia. Right? So it wasn't a case of importing a best practice. It wasn't saying, we know what the best labor law in the world looks like. We're going to conditionalize our loans on you receiving this until you've actually done what we think constitutes the best practice labor law. We're going to let you grow your own labor law. Now, initially, that means probably years' worth of very judicially imperfect looking decisions. Right? It makes it very problematic for the bank to stand even in a building like this or on the 13th floor and saying, we're going to spend 2 years doing non-best practice rule of law reform, because our theory of change says the way you ultimately get a more legitimate rule of law in this context is to grow your own. Right? You happen to be sitting here on a Friday, which is the end of Law, Justice and Development Week here at the World Bank. On Monday morning, I had the privilege of being on a panel with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Afghanistan and the Minister of Justice of Liberia. And the concluding remarks from the Minister of Justice in Liberia were wonderful. She said, you know what you guys should do? Your first assumption should be you know nothing about the country you work in. The second assumption should be, when you think you know something about the other country, go back to rule number 1. And rule number 3 should be, even when you have actually kind of figured out one little part of the country, assume that when you go 5 miles away, rule number 1 kicks back in again. Right? Now, that is entirely antithetical to the way in which bank people or development professionals of any organization function. We're paid to be experts. We're paid to recognize situations as variations on a theme, so that when we fly around the world and stay in nice hotels for a week, we see something that we've seen a couple of times before or hundreds of times before, and our mental models kick in for how we should address that particular problem. But the rule of law and local governance are, if they are social constructions, if they are inventions of people and have the same status, more of a language rather than a technology, then how we engage with that should be fundamentally different. And the kind of theory we should invoke for how we go about trying to build it, I would suggest, should be very different as well. 2 of the best books I've ever read on category 5 are to do with sort of it's I call very simply, sort of simplistically called sort of evolving moral outrage. But if the best book that I read for the last 5 years is Lynn Hunt's Inventing Human Rights, a history of unbelievable story about how a world for which slavery and judicial torture was normal for tens of thousands of years, suddenly in a space of 40 years went from being that to not being that. And I'll have a slide on that actually shortly. But the point of her book was not that this wonderful thing happened and then everyone sort of went home. There was this unbelievable roller coaster ride up to 1948 until the UN signed the International Human Rights Accords. And even now, these are still being very imperfectly realized. So if you have, say, a human rights development program, you're pretty much on and you take Hunt's sort of rendering of this story seriously, you're pretty much on a 300-year cycle to see anything like the true realization of a lot of what you've been talking about. So that's sort of, Adam Hochschild's wonderful book, Bury These Chains, on the ending of slavery and the different kinds of strategies that social movements groups were able to employ to delegitimize slavery as an act. Celebrity endorsement, campaign buttons, all those sort of things that are now routine parts of everyday campaigning were invented by these guys. It wasn't sort of something that came out of a lab. They experimented with it. They figured out that this was an effective way of trying to change how things worked. And most of them died for their troubles as well. So, trying to seriously mess with power, trying to give a better shot in life to most of the people that we work with in developing countries who are victims of land grabs, victims of international companies that can pretty much do whatever they like. If you want to try and push back against that, justice for the poor, in some sense, I oftentimes just think we've got to be very careful what we wish for. It's where if we actually start to mess with power in a serious way, that has big risk implications for this organization, has big implications for our career. But we've survived so far, and this is what we're trying to do. And this is the kind of theory we're trying to, and the experience and history that we're trying to bring to bear in doing that. The last one is sort of actually what most of our work entails, which is the mediation work between operating in environments of deep legal pluralism, where the capacity of the existing legal system is just very threadbare at best. Where there's enormous juridical ambiguity as to where the boundaries between customary and state law and religious law, for that matter, abound. And Vivek's written very nicely on this work. It's done some of the really pioneering work on this in Sierra Leone. Much of our work in the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu and Indonesia, Cambodia, are variations on this work of trying to understand in ways that are unobservable in any statistical sense oftentimes, like a big iceberg, right? You can see what's above the water, but most of what's going on is actually underneath. And how you figure out what's going on underneath that water, which is so crucial to the legitimacy of dispute resolution and claim making in the lives of poor people, is really crucial. So let me just quickly look at sort of what I think the role of deliberation plays in all of this. In a co-optation kind of strategy, it's largely about sort of forging insider and outsider networks. The work that Lauren Benton and Chris Bailey have done so powerfully on the role of law under colonial systems was not just looking at this as a straight up imposition of one system on crushing another, but looking at the way in which pushback occurred, how different combinations of insider-outsider networks produced what now is the rule of law or the prevailing legal system in each of these countries, ostensibly with a similar kind of legal origin, in some civil common law sort of way, but up close and personal, the particularities of these particular systems, because of these dynamics of the insider-outsider networks, have rendered these legal systems very different over long periods of time. The codification system, one could see this as sort of negotiating when and how this is going to occur, or indeed resisting it from the Jim Scott sort of perspective. Legislation obviously involves sort of getting your candidates in and then hoping that you get enough of them to get the votes. I won't talk too much about that. The more interesting one that I've already mentioned, I think, at least for the very local level work that we do, is around these deliberative contestational issues, as opposed to mobilizational contests, where you're just trying to get naked power struggles or interest groups sort of arguing it out. The deliberative contestation that Chris and I write about is much more about how different groups are able to negotiate what it is even that the issue is about, and what will constitute a reasonable and locally legitimate resolution to these things. So it's still contestational, it's still lots of argument, lots of fighting, but it's occurring in a deliberative space as opposed to a mobilizational rioting kind of space. The role that Lynn Hunt in particular talks about in her work on the transformations that occurred in human rights law were crucially looking at how ideas themselves change. It wasn't just about the law per se. It wasn't just about interest groups. It was a whole sensibility around how elites came to understand the plight of other people. So she looks very movingly, incredibly interestingly at the rise of the modern novel in the 17th century as a way of being able to, for the first time ever, convey to the masses a sense of genuine sympathy and empathy with people who are different from themselves. She uses 3 wonderful novels written by men about the lives of young women going effectively into arranged marriages as an example of a sea change occurring in the culture of what was acceptable, thinkable, and sayable at a particular time, and how all of that occurred. So the networks, the reading clubs, the ways in which these ideas filter and become and act in some sense autonomously from the broader politics of the time, I think is a really fascinating way of thinking about this. And you have to be sort of Lynn Hunt's age and stature and sophistication and to have worked on an issue for so long to be able to tell a story as compelling as she does about these different ways in which politics and ideas simultaneously worked to transfer and alter what was considered legitimate. The last one, obviously, with mediation and a lot of our stuff in Justice for the Poor, with paralegals and with other groups sort of working at the interface of these different customary and formal legal systems, is all about, again, trying to negotiate legitimacy, having enough credibility on both sides of that line to be an effective mediator. You're a local level diplomat, in effect, right? And your job is mediating not just between formal law and customary law, you're also operating between multiple forms of customary law itself, right? So you're ultimately functioning in multiple legal jurisdictional spaces, and to have the capacity to do that, I think is a very unique skill. I haven't got time for all these different. So I had ways of arraying these different things. Let me just conclude by sort of one key message that I think that comes out of this is this: there's the roller coaster way in which rule of law reform occurs. This is just a horribly stylized sort of rendering of Lynn Hunt's story, where you have 40,000 years of human history where slavery is normal, where torturing people on the rack is entirely acceptable as a way of extracting truthful statements from people. And yet by the time you get to the US Declaration of Independence, it's a self-evident truth that all people, except for women and slaves, are equal. Right? How did that happen? That is just unbelievable that you could get that transformation could occur like that. And again, read Jeffrey Robertson's book on the tyrannicide. How was it that the divine right of kings, that for pharaohs and everyone back in human history, the top guy at the top of the pole could do whatever the hell he liked? That was always been the way it is. Who challenged that? How did that change? Right. So when you get the French Revolution sort of rallying around liberty, fraternity, equity. I mean, these are huge, big changes, right? And then it all unravels. That's the beauty of this story, right? It wasn't this grand, shining moment. We all clapped out and congratulated ourselves for having achieved this. You have 150 years pioneered by eugenics and an alternative quasi-science that delegitimizes the notion of human equality, and instead tries to use brain size, skin color, and all sorts of other things as a way of reasserting difference, right? So that has to be fought all over again, right? And it's not until you get to the end of the Second World War, when we've blown ourselves up for the second time, finally, that people decide that maybe having an international agreement that we're all equal is maybe a good idea, right? And we're still fighting that, right? We're still living it out, and we're going to still have to keep giving it out. And our grandchildren, I suggest, will have to keep doing that as well, because it's never achieved. It's a constant, precisely because it's a human invention. It's something we've constructed, and we have to keep building the political constituencies to make that happen. Now, if that's sort of in a nutshell, or at least one example of a 400-year process that happens in rule of law reform, it's not unsurprising that the template cut and paste sort of model that we've tried so often for so long in so many countries has been an absolute disaster. The bar is unbelievably low in terms of trying to come up with a better alternative to all of that. But I think that taking history seriously, taking anthropology seriously, taking the alternatives bodies of knowledge that are out there can be a really useful way of trying to rewrite that template and, in some sense, hopefully also change the hardware that goes with it. Thanks very much.